Today, we have two Gilbreth lecturers. The first is Dr. Amy Kaleita. She's an associate professor of agricultural and biosystems engineering at Iowa State University. She teaches courses in programming, numerical methods in agricultural engineering, and soil and water conservation. Her research is in an area of information technology for precision conservation. The natural environment is highly spatially and temporally variable, and being able to determine what land management strategies will be most suitable in a particular location requires that we are able to characterize the variable factors at an appropriate scale and synthesize the data with respect to their influence on hydrology. Dr. Kaleita's research is aimed at using robust and smart technology and analysis to maintain or enhance environmental quality while enabling a safe and sustainable food production system. She earned her bachelor's degree in agricultural engineering from Pennsylvania State University, a master's degree in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD in agricultural engineering from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Please welcome Amy Kaleita to the stage. The floor is yours, Amy.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I've already been inspired and inflamed, I guess, by some of the things that I have heard today and been able to talk about during the breaks and so forth. So thank you very much. I'm going to begin with a little bit of a historical review. This is a painting by famous Iowa painter Grant Wood, who is most well known for his painting American Gothic with the guy with the pitchfork. And if you go to that house, it just still stands today, they'll give you the overalls and the pitchfork and like the dread. You can get your picture taken in front of it. It's hilarious. You should all do it. So he was well known for his paintings of Iowa landscape in the early decades of the last century, so the early 1900s. And this is one of the paintings that he did of rural Iowa during that time. So I want you to take a look at what's happening here in this painting. So first of all, it's not meant to be a photograph, but it does kind of capture the spirit of how farming was done in those decades. Everything was done by hand, usually at a pretty small scale. So let's take a look. There's two people working at planting this field. They've got a little string line so that they get the plants planted in a straight line. They have a little basket with the seedlings in it, and the woman is hoeing a little place for the seedling to go. The guy's dropping the seed in there and planting it in place, and then the woman is taking that ladle and putting a little spoonful of water to give a good environment for that seedling to take root. And in the background, there's another guy with two workhorses, probably plowing up the field, and right in the middle of the field is a tree that they're farming around. And so this is taking 3 people and 2 horses in a tree to work a very small plot of ground. It was essentially what we would call today precision farming because they were really being very precise. They're putting water only where the seedling was going. They were getting the perfectly straight line to plant in, but it was very, very labor intensive. After mechanization, didn't take that much labor to work the same amount of ground. So now we have a situation where we can farm very large swaths of agricultural land with a very small amount of labor. Large equipment, but small labor. It's very efficient in terms of labor and time than the old non-mechanized systems, and this is what has enabled kind of industrial scale farming. In the industrial scale farming, for the ease of farming operations, we tend to treat the whole field uniformly, and we farm to kind of the average to maximize the overall average productivity of the ground. And to maybe the untrained eye, when you drive past or fly over these fields, everything does look fairly uniform. But underneath all of that apparent uniformity is actually a highly variable, very nonlinear, and somewhat chaotic system. And the precision ag advances that I'm going to talk about and hypothesize about today were really kicked off in the early 90s with 2 kind of transformative technologies. The first was the descrambling of the GPS signal that enabled high accuracy results for civilian applications. And the second was yield monitoring, so that a farmer could attach a yield monitor to his combine and generate at first data, and then with the GPS system, a map of how different sections of his field were performing. And lo and behold, there was all this variability underneath there. Some areas of the field, very high performing, other areas of the field, not very high performing. And that becomes exacerbated during times of stress. These are some images from a friend of mine who got up in a plane during the 2012 growing season. 2012 in the Midwest was a drought year, so it was a lot of water stress. And in Iowa, we don't use a whole lot of irrigation, so it's mostly rain-fed agriculture. And tremendous amount of variability in crop performance, from some areas not doing so well to some areas doing fine, to in other fields, most of it is dead, and a couple of wet pockets are doing okay. So as we move into a time when we hypothesize or we suspect that we might have a climate that tends to go towards the extreme ends, we also expect that variability to really increase. So what's driving all of that variability? Well, at the fundamental sense, there's differences in soil. Soil fertility is different from one location to another. Soil texture is different from one location to another, and that makes its performance different. Topography, even in a place like Iowa that seems kind of flat, can be really variable. And this is my friend Jacob's field, actually. And down in the lower corner there, from a high area that's kind of actually mucky at the top to a very steep slope that's hard to farm without getting a lot of soil erosion, to a drainage ditch at the bottom where we can transport a lot of nutrients and soil out if we don't manage it appropriately. So when precision agriculture became a thing that people started doing, this flow chart illustrates the way that process happened. They would ask, is there significant spatial yield variability, and is it consistent from year to year? And if it is consistent, and you know the cause of the variability, you can try to eliminate the cause of variability. If it's not consistent, well, then I don't know what to do about it, and we just manage the whole field uniformly. But I would like to propose a different paradigm for how precision agriculture should go. Is there variability? Yes, there is. That's more of a rhetorical question in the new paradigm. If we can determine the causes and the effects of variability, then we will manage them. We will manage that variability to tailor the treatment of individual pieces of ground on a very small scale to optimize the system. And that objective function is going to have multiple criteria. It's going to be one where we are trying to maximize yield, because with that 9 billion population coming, we definitely want to have enough food for all those folks. We want to also consider profitability, so it has to be high yields with cheap enough inputs that we're still making money. And finally, my background is actually as a soil and water conservation engineer, so we want to minimize impact on the environment, or even develop systems that will improve environmental quality through the production of agriculture. So here's my kind of fantasy vision about how this unfolds. And some of the things I'm about to say are actually things that are happening on many farms today. So the farmer goes through the field to plant the seed. Maybe the farmer is in the cab, maybe she's back at the command center in the barn. There are sensors in the soil giving information about soil temperature, soil water content. The planter optimizes the placement of the seed in terms of depth and location, saves all of that information to a data repository so that it can be used for analysis later on. During the season, autonomous aerial vehicles fly over the crop, acting as a crop scout, identifying problem areas where things might be going wrong, and recommending and allowing for recommendations of things that we might do to address those problems. At the end of the season, we continue to log the yields and be able to use that layer upon layer of data to make better decisions for next year's crop. So what will it take to be able to realize this vision? First, we have to be able to sense and monitor more data. Agriculture is a field that is unusual in the sense that it is actually relatively data poor. For the amount of management decisions that have to be done, it's actually very difficult and expensive to get the right information to base those decisions on. And because all of those things come at a cost, knowing which data is the most important to capture and when you need to capture it is really important. Knowing what management will be the most appropriate response to the state of the system that you are observing. And finally, having the technology to vary the management. And in fact, having the technology to vary the management is perhaps the easiest of those elements, and is to a large degree things that are already being done in really innovative and interesting ways. So along the lines of the first frontier, sensing and monitoring information, we need to have robust, inexpensive smart sensors, both remotely, things that fly over at maybe a large scale, as well as unmanned vehicles that fly over at a relatively low elevation, as well as sensors buried in the ground, so that when we see areas in the field that are not performing as well as we think they can, we can trace back through all of the data that we've collected to try to pinpoint what went wrong. So in this colorful map, this is an example of trying to figure out what went wrong. The map over here is labeled yield, and the map over here is labeled population. So that's an indicator that there are some areas in this field where the population was low, and I can kind of guess from looking at this that these are water courses, where during the early parts of the season there was water flowing through there that made it hard for the seeds to have strong germination, so they just didn't grow as well in those areas. And certainly you see areas where then the yield is not as high, but you also see these two big stripes of low yield right down the middle of the field. That's a sort of an unnaturally linear feature in agriculture that suggests that there might have been something going wrong with the equipment. So we need to have sensors in all of these places so that when things go wrong, we can trace back and figure out what the problems were. What do we need to observe? My fantasy is we're observing everything at every location at all times. Soil water content, temperature, soil chemistry, texture, plant development. Down at the bottom is I had to inject some of my own research into this presentation, so this is a graph from one of my own papers where we were studying whether or not we could use a remote sensing platform to detect the moment at which the corn tassel starts to shed pollen. Because if you can, then you can plug that into a wind model and figure out where that pollen went. It was actually motivated by concern over drift from GMO fields to plants that were planted, to fields that were planted without GMO, and wondering about cross-contamination. And in fact, you can, using the right sensors, detect all kinds of very detailed information about plant development and use that to understand how the whole system is performing. But it's complicated because each one of those metrics requires a different spatial resolution and a different temporal resolution of data. So once you collect the data, you have to then communicate the data as well. So both from sensor to sensor, perhaps. In one of the projects I've been working on, we're looking at variable wireless communication. Wireless communication in production agriculture is actually pretty popular in like vineyards and orchards where the plants are in the same location every year. So you can have antennas sticking up out of the ground and it doesn't really interfere with anything. But in a field crop setting, you can't have those antennas sticking up out of the ground because they will interfere with all of your operations or they'll get damaged. So we were looking at using wireless information technology to be able to transmit from one sensor to the next sensor, finally out to the edge of the field, where there was a base station that would collect that information, store it on a data logger, and also relay it through a wireless link to a computer at kind of the command center. So communication networks will be really important. And then, it's not enough to just have data. You have to convert that data into some actionable knowledge. So in order to do that, we need to have good cataloging, good tracking, not just get the data, but have it and be able to store it and organize it in a way that enables us to make decisions on that data. So, and we need to have both historical records that we can do some long-term trend analysis, but we also need to have some data that we collect sort of on the go, as we say, or in a more instantaneous way, and deliver that information immediately to the user. That's going to enable us to separate what are those long-term trends from the things that are more based on this year's climate or this year's weather patterns or something interesting that was happening at this time. And then finally, because we probably can't manage to the centimeter level, what is the optimal management resolution that we should expect from these systems? So some smart innovations in that area are necessary. And if just having the data and being able to store it and make sense of it is half the battle, knowing what to do with it is the other half. Finding relationships, machine learning, data fusion, data assimilation are things that I think are going to be really important here. That's an area that I work in myself. It's super interesting. And it is a way to turn disparate data into actionable items. Finally, we need nimble response systems that are able to respond to both those long-term stationary trends in a sort of forward planning way, but also be able to respond to those really emerging issues that we notice only when they come up in the data. We need good control systems. We need decision systems that can account for uncertainty. Production agriculture is an area in which the uncertainties are very, very high. And I remember a project that I was working on with a colleague in another branch of engineering where the uncertainties are relatively low. Like in a manufacturing setting, if you set your system to make a ball bearing about this big, they don't usually come out maybe this big or that big, right? But in production agriculture, you can plan things at the outset. There's all kinds of chaos that happens. Weather is the major driver, but it's not the only driver. And so being able to have decision systems that are capable of accommodating these very, very wide confidence intervals will be really important. This graph is from a former student of mine who was working on seeing if they could model the probability of leaving a certain percent of the nitrogen that they had applied as fertilizer in the field at the end of the year. Because ideally, you would want to leave no nitrogen fertilizer at the end of the year, but you don't know how much the plant is going to use when you apply the nitrogen at the beginning of the year, because it all depends on the weather and how the plant grows and all of those things. So decision support systems that will accommodate the uncertainty and the fact that the uncertainty changes as you go through the growing season will be really important. And they need to be adaptable to new and emerging circumstances. We need nimble response systems that will be able to provide really customized solutions on a small scale. When I was a graduate student, my research group was working on what they called the smart sprayer, which was machine vision on the back of a sprayer that would identify when there was greenness outside of the plant row. And if there was, you can assume that that was a weed, and you'd put a little squirt of weed killer on it to get rid of it. But we need to have equipment in general that is smaller and more flexible than that. So a little shout out to iRobot here, and I'm waiting for the field bow, which will be a combination of a seed bow and a weed bow and a fert bow and a number of other things that I think we could use some really small, flexible, multifunctional robotic equipment to be able to do. And finally, to a large extent, farmers that operate very small plots of ground know a lot about the spatial variability in their field. They don't necessarily have all of the data to support why is it that way and what should I do about it, but they have a lot of historical knowledge of performance of different pieces of ground. And how can we capitalize on that local knowledge in the developing world to enable them to leapfrog over having to do uniform management all across the field? Applications for smaller fields will also be important. A lot of the precision ag stuff is very exciting for people that work where I work, where the fields are pretty big, or in the Dakotas where they're really big, but are not things that are readily adaptable yet to really small-scale operations. So how do we adapt to that low technology environment in a way that still optimizes the system for what they are doing? That's the end. Thank you very much.
That was great. That was a great presentation. So Amy, thank you very much for that presentation, and it's our great honor to present you with a citation, and allow me to read the citation for you, and then we'll get our photos snapped. Okay. It's to Amy Kaleita is hereby honored as a recipient of the Gilbreth Lecturership in recognition of outstanding contributions to the field of agriculture and biosystems engineering and presentation of the lecture on applications of precision agriculture in rural communities at the National Academy of Engineering 2013 annual meeting. Chad Holliday and Dan Moat are
Thank you very much.
Congratulations
Thank
very
you.
much to you.
Thank Thank you. I also just wanted to say for one brief moment, I was inspired by reading a little bit about Lily and Gilbreth on Wikipedia, which is where I try not to get all of my information from, and her 12 children. I have 2 children, and I recognize that there's a little bit of an interaction term. It's really like having 3, so 12 is more like having, I don't even know what that is, but it's very impressive, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to learn a little bit more about her and her family as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Only 10 to go.